All right. Hi, everybody. So this is games/culture, challenges and opportunities of putting games in museums. I'm Chris Totten. I'm going to be moderating / I was the guy who posted this in the Mages spreadsheet as an idea. So
Blame him. This is all his fault.
yeah, it's all my fault. So the hour you're about to lose of your lives, I'm not sorry. Haha. So we're going to just briefly introduce ourselves and introduce our interests in games and museums and having games in museums. So real quick, I'll let you guys introduce first. Go ahead.
Well, I'm Dan Gronsky. I'm a professor in media studies and actually mostly English composition these days, which is less fun than media studies. So that's my interest in game studies and that sort of angle. As far as museums, I am really just a frequent patron. I love museums. I'm the sort of person who travels all around, and when I get to a new city, I'm like, what museums do they got here? And that's what I do for fun. So.
I'm Brock Rao. I'm a PhD student at University of Maryland. My dissertation work is on whether video games can be artworks or not, which focuses centrally on their role in museums and how museums show both artworks and cultural objects and the relationship between those two. So this one's kind of right up my alley.
Yeah. So like I said, I'm Chris Totten. I am the game artist in residence at American University's Game Lab. I am also one of the founding organizers of the Smithsonian American Art Museum Indie Arcade, which we just had its second year a couple weeks ago. So, yeah. That's it.
And my name's Kevin Flanagan. I'm a lecturer at University of Pittsburgh, and I teach mainly in film studies, but my interest here is on kind of the cultural function of museums in general and what museums do, what audiences kind of expect with them. And so I'm really interested in how video games pose a problem/opportunity for the museum as an institution. And again, I come from a place kind of where Dan does, where I like to go to museums and I like to see the strategies of display and see how they deal with difficult objects. And so I'm kind of interested in that stuff.
So already in the discussion we've had, excuse me, we've hit on a couple of elements of video games in the museum. So one is that we don't necessarily have to think of just in art museums, but also in historical museums as pieces of media to be preserved and collected. So a lot of it goes into curation and really finding a place for these pieces. Really quickly from the panel, what kind of games, first of all, do we think we should be targeting for museum exhibition? Is this something where we need to be like, Call of Duty is important because it was popular at this time and thus is an example, so we should be having it in? Or is it, something we should look for? Like, what do you guys think we should look for?
Well, that's a really great question because it brings around to the idea of, what is the canon of video games? Mm-hmm. And when you look at anything, when you look at, painting, sculpture, books, movies, it's not an easy thing to set a canon, and nobody is ever happy with it when it's done. There's always somebody who says, no, this should be in, no, this should not be in there. And so that is a really interesting, really hard to answer question, actually.
Yeah.
Well, I think a model might be something like the work that the Criterion Collection does. So they, for a long time, had kind of like a snooty reputation, but then they realized that they were just such a big cultural force that they put in, Armageddon?
They did put Armageddon.
The Rock,
Yeah.
I think.
Yep.
And so obviously those are amazing films.
Armageddon especially, right?
Yeah, right.
Particularly.
And part of the,
it does sit funnily, next to like Godard or something.
Yeah.
Right.
Well-
but culturally importantly, it doesn't, right, as far as being big. So Call of Duty, yeah, that should fit in. FIFA, Madden, right? These are big things
it's
that
a
you can't
cultural
take
work.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I wonder if then the question of money might be something that's worth talking about too, because I'm sure part of the reason Criterion put Armageddon in there is because they figured they could sell X units of Armageddon at $40 a pop, and
So I would say, before moving maybe on centrally to kind of, is a thing successful enough to be canonized? Another approach that may be more fun as a thought experiment than an actual way to do things is, well, oftentimes when we go to museums, we don't necessarily see the best version of something, we see a representative version of something. So if you
Yeah.
go to the Smithsonian and you look at the way American life was in the 19th century, you don't necessarily see the most well-constructed harness for a horse, you see a representative harness that happened to have been preserved correctly. So I think one model might also be to preserve and display games that are representative of trends. So not necessarily trying to find the best beat-em-up game, but maybe finding the most representative beat-em-up game when that was a genre that was important.
Answer to both Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Right, so essentially it would be a museum of just Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in every iteration. But the idea, though, that you're looking for objects that say something about the historical context that aren't necessarily the best of what's been said and done, because I think we have a tendency with museums to say that they give us the best of culture, but they don't necessarily have to. They can just give us a good slice of culture that says something.
Like how every museum has a Monet's water lilies, but only some of them have good water lilies.
Right, but it sort of fits a niche. It fulfills an expectation. It illustrates a genre, something like that.
This is a good. I think this is why the American Smithsonian is a really good candidate for having a collection that they're trying to build, because the art in the Smithsonian of American art is not actually that great. It is mostly just representative of what was going on in early American time, which was not the best stuff being made, right? It's just really representative. I mean, there's really poor landscapes. You can go walk around for hours and look at these things. And they're fascinating, but they're not the greatest. And I think that's important to have for video games, too.
So I want to, this touches on the idea of, I want to revisit the canon idea, but one thing that was mentioned that I want to hit on as well is there's the notion of money, and I also think visitation. So what opportunities do we see? So I think one of the big interests from the museum standpoint as an institution, because like us as game people, we're like, games are in museums, yeah, it's awesome. Our media form is being acknowledged and displayed, it's excellent. So it's exciting, so we have a vested interest in getting stuff in there. But from the museum standpoint, one thing that I've noticed working with museums doing game stuff is, and I think the art of video games at American Art a few years ago really hit on this, was they tried it out, and they realized that, oh, hey, people will come to our museum to see these works because they're super popular and people like them a lot. So there's an element there, again, that you touched on with saying like, okay, so maybe you have the Call of Duty game because people think it's popular. There was a lot of criticism of art of video games when it came out, because they were like, well, why is that in there? Why isn't this in there? Some people said like, why isn't Tetris in there? But then why is like Star Fox Assault in there? And the answer is because they opened up for fan voting. Mm-hmm. But there is that balance, and how does, going back to the canon idea and the curation idea, how do you think that becomes a canon? Like, how do you balance that visitation versus the canon stuff? Because,
We're in a weird space with this, because when you do talk about books, when you do talk about even movies, you're also talking about something with an established order, critics, well-known voices, educated people who really start putting this thing together. Video games are very populist. So when you start talking about who is evaluating this, where's the critical praise? It's guys like you. It's regular people who experience this stuff, and especially even when you talk about some of the other stuff. You talk about the famous paintings. You talk about the really. We were talking just a second ago, very briefly, about French New Wave films when we were talking about the Criterion Collection. This was not stuff that a lot of regular people had access to. Forget about interest in, didn't have access to. You guys, you could play any game. I mean, you maybe have to make some monetary choices there, but you have access to them all. And the fact that that populism is sort of informing who is picking the canon is also complicating things, because when you talk about, these higher academic circles, it's not necessarily that they had a better idea than anybody else, but there were less people involved in the conversation. And if you've ever tried to do this yourself, you've heard the expression, too many cooks in the kitchen. That's a real thing.
Well, I think that a point that I'll use an example from film and then relate it to games. When I see that there is a screening of a movie, I am often concerned about what format the screening is in, and if it's a digital projection of a movie that I have access to a Blu-ray of, I'm less likely to go, but if it's an original 35 millimeter print that's maybe been restored, I am more likely to go. So with games, my sense is that there's one way in which you can see people wanting to go to a museum to see a game and just to see it in the public place and marvel at, yes, this game that I like has been publicly acknowledged as good, but then there's another argument for going to a place to experience a game in a certain way because you can't otherwise experience that game in that way. And what I mean by that is we now have the Internet Archive and emulated access to any game through our browser, and that in its own way is a museum, but I'm more likely to go to a museum to get access to a Spectrum, cartridge that I cannot get that would cost me lots of money to experience in that context, right? So there's maybe some concession that could be made when curating game access in a museum to getting what you might call a destination item, an item that is difficult to experience in another context, right? And the same way that, I'll drive 5 hours to see a 35 millimeter screening of a film if it's the only way to see that version of it, right? So there's something about format that must be attended to when curating, and it's obviously Art of Video Games was cognizant of that when they did that. But.
So I want to return to that, actually, because I think that fits in with another discussion that we were having in the email leading up to this. But, so in terms of canon and curating for visiting versus curating for, finding the...
Like the permanent collection?
Well, for Indie Arcade, we didn't, because it's an event and not a full exhibition, but and not going necessarily into the collection. But one thing that we ran into for that, because it's an event, because it's something where it's judged on how many people are we going to get to visit it, we ran into, and we're constantly fighting this, because there are the people that want to have it be let's make it the artsiest game event we can, and that's really cool. I like that. I hope that we can find a day where, we can have very artsy, esoteric, cool, weird stuff, and that's it, and people will come visit it and be super excited about it. But we're not there yet, at least not in my opinion. So you've got to have, and I think one thing that's really worked out and that me and some of the other organizers have fought for is, you know what though? People want to come play Donkey Kong. So, you have you have to balance that, what are people gonna come and visit? And some of that is, you can download Donkey Kong on the Wii U, but we've got a cabinet, guys. And, MAGFest has been fantastic for that.
So that actually brings me to a question I wanted to ask you guys, something I thought up on the way down here. Is an arcade a museum?
Yes.
Why?
No.
Let's get into it.
Can be.
Because I was thinking about it, and I didn't come up with a 100% answer on my own either, actually. But the idea that an arcade is a place with a curated collection where they make selections, they're displayed, they're arranged. Often there is information regarding the units there. Very museum-esque in that regard. On the other hand, it's also a place where you go in, you go to experience it as well. I mean, it's a play experience is an experience. But on the other hand, it's a far more commercial venture than most of your average museums. And the amount of information you get on any individual unit it varies from location to location, let's say that.
I think
So
that
I wasn't really sure how
the function
to
of the
answer that.
museum historically is preservation, and in a commercial arcade, as much as you might have somebody doing some maintenance to the cabinets, you also have, years of pizza grease being kind of seeped into, the joysticks. You have a sense that what
makes
is
it authentic.
right, and you also have this sense of sort of cycling through and keeping up with the times. So the historical function doesn't necessarily remain constant. Rather, Gauntlet Dark Legacy comes out and suddenly that's the cabinet to buy because that's the cabinet consumers want. So I think it kind of is like a pseudo museum, but then again, like some things that are designated as museums are also pseudo museums. You know what I mean?
Fair enough.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I think this illustrates a problem.
wait, hold on.
Oh, okay.
So there's a couple hands up, and I don't want to not acknowledge that you guys are there. So we're gonna talk among the panel for like about 15 more minutes, and then we'll open it up. Cool? Yeah. All right, cool. Yeah, because I know that you guys are itching to join, and I know that we have some people who've done this before in the audience, so we want to be inclusive going forward. Go ahead.
So one of the problems with museums is some museums you'd have to pay to get in, and other museums you don't. So when the Smithsonian had their exhibition, the aims of that were able to be different. They didn't have to try to draw as many people in for the same reasons. They couldn't do it for the same financial reasons directly as, like, say, MoMA, right, who can charge like $25 a head. And this is what the big distinction, I think this is what Kevin's pointing out. Like, if you can run a commercial arcade and just your selection is always, how much space do I have? Which cabinets can I put in which will get me the most dollars, right? Versus what happens now as arcades are dying off as like a cultural thing is people who, the only reason they stay open for the most part is people love them. And when they love them, they're not just trying to make the most money, because if they were, they would put something else in that space. Then they start to do curatorial work, which is when they become this like pseudo museum, right? Then they start caring about not just the machines that make the most, but is this thing representative? Is this the kind of video game that someone should play when they come into an arcade? Right?
There's
They
an
want to-
arcade called the Fun Spot up in New Hampshire,
Yeah.
which is 100% a museum.
Yeah. So, and your question about are they a museum? Because, I mean, we could ask this about the console room downstairs. Is
Yes,
it a
we could.
museum? And what I really like about the context is I feel like when I go to a museum, there is some educational component of how they're displayed. But really, when does the education begin and end? If I go up to Fun Spot or down to Raleigh where there's like a barcade there's like 3 barcades within a square mile, right? I'm not gonna get any educational benefit out of the barcade. I might be like, holy crap, NBA Jam and Wings, this is awesome. But, you know, I'm not gonna learn anything. But if I took my daughter to, well, I'm not gonna take her to the barcade, but if I took her to a video arcade, you know, she'd be like, holy cow, like, I've never seen that before. And then, yeah, like where you do have ones where there's pizza grease on it and be like, this is what it was like all the time.
It's part of the material culture of the object is this sort of veneer of like consumed pizza. You
Yeah.
know, in the way that archaeologists study like, this, fire pit was used for this reason.
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, this joystick had like pizza on it, you know.
So
I
I always-
often wonder what future generations will think of what we've left behind.
Right.
Lots of pizza boxes.
Yep. But yeah, I mean, there is like a contextual component when you have somebody who hasn't been in that context and it's not a familiar context to them where it suddenly becomes educational because it's like, this is what going to the mall was when I was your age. So I feel like they may not formally be museums, but they're almost like archaeological sites for people who haven't seen it, right? So one thing that I want to return to again, like I said, was experiencing games in certain ways. So there's the idea that you can come to MAGFest and see, like you can play Galaga as Galaga. You can come play Play Choice 10. You can play 6-person X-Men, right?
What a world.
Yeah, exactly. So, but there was a discussion beforehand via email about if games are going to start appearing in museums, are we going to start seeing developers creating games for museums? So I think there's a couple elements to that. One is, do you see like an Activision, you know, like Ubisoft has UbiArt, and they make, you know, games like Valiant Hearts, where that actually might be something that is made to be in a museum, but they still make their popular stuff. Beyond that, indie developers are also making things like the what's it called at GDC? Like there's an alternate controller style, like an experimental game workshop at GDC. So if you make a weird controller, like I'm working with somebody right now making a controller that is a quilt, right? So we would take our quilt controller and put it in that collection or enter it to be included in that show. Do we start to see then, do you guys think, people making weird experimental stuff to become that destination item?
Well, here's the thing, because video art is a thing.
Yeah.
And video art is not a movie, which is a different thing. And I'm a little concerned that if people start trying to make games that are those kind of museum pieces, you wind up with not games. And I'll level with you guys, I've seen exactly one singular good piece of video art in my entire life. It's a piece called Migration, and I forget the guy's name who made it. It's a really wonderful piece. I saw it at the Art Museum in Minneapolis. Every other piece of video art I've seen doesn't take advantage of the medium it's created in, is too static, is too much like a movie. It's a weird limbo state for a piece of art to exist in. And I think if you tried to do that with games, you'd wind up with the same thing. Do I play this? Do I watch this? Do I experience this? What am I doing here?
Well, I think my response is it goes back to the multiple function of museums. So there are games that you can get that could be made specifically commissioned by a museum. I know Simony that Ian Bogos did is one such game. There are games that could be developed and designed with sort of this high cultural sensibility in mind at that early stage of inception, right? And that could be one way in. But then there are also games that could be that could work with the educational mission of a museum, right? A game to help explain a concept that is otherwise being talked about in the museum, right? So, not just for children, but for understanding migration patterns, to use the word you just used, of nomadic people in Neolithic times. You could make a game about that to get somebody to engage differently with that material. So I think there's multiple paths into it. Or, to go back to what I said earlier, to try to make the most representative game of a style in hopes that in curation, what was being looked for was the most representative, and then you could sort of weirdly design
Yeah, I mean, it
that
raises
way.
this question of why put a video game into a museum ever, right? Out of just other than just raw historical preservation, right? If you think that there are reasons beyond that, things of cultural importance or intersection or anything like that, then I think it's obvious that people will eventually start making, if they're not already, making objects for that purpose, right? Saying, this is a thing, there are video games that you make to play for fun, and that's kind of the whole story, but there are other video games that are made to do something else or to do something extra. And those might have this very thing in mind, that this is supposed to be regarded in a way that's appropriate for a museum, that's appropriate for seeing it as it relates to other works like this, and other broader works. I'm supposed to look at this in relation to ballet and film and literature and et cetera.
So it's funny you mentioned ballet too, because I have a colleague who does dance games, and he's presenting his game right now at the Kennedy Center. There's also, if you guys search the game Cello Fortress, it's a game where it's a shooter. It's a 4-player shooter. One of the players is a cellist. So as they play, it controls the bad guy, and then you're a bunch of people trying to shoot the bad guy. But it's a piece of performance art because the cello is turned into game actions, but then you also play it like a video game. And again, this is one of the things that we also deal with at for Indie Arcade, was the notion of, before I said, you want that bait, you want Donkey Kong and Mega Man and Mario to be present and get people in the door, but then you want there to be discoverable content. So we had a game this past year that was a board game where you arranged patches, but the patches had conductive thread in them. There was another one where you controlled the game via a telegraph machine. And so I think the question to me of do you create these museum pieces, I think that's still kind of open, because you're right. There are times when, and I see it all the time with VR. There's times when I look at a VR game and I'm like, this is a game that uses the Oculus Rift. And then there are times where I'm like, this is a game that can only exist on the Oculus Rift. Same thing if the difference between making a game on a mobile device and everything that the indie developer Simigo does, where it's this can only exist on an iPhone. because they've used its technology in a certain way. So
Well,
I think,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
I was going to say, I think that almost brings us back around to the first thing we said at the beginning of the panel, which is, do we have to be doing this in an art museum?
Yeah.
It's starting to sound more and more, the more we talk, you guys tell me if I'm wrong here, it's starting to sound more and more like this is not really appropriate to an art museum. Leave alone whether games are art or are not art, but like the best place to display these things seems more like in an industrial museum or a technological museum.
I think there's multiple ways to do it, because on the flip side, like I've shown in art museums because I made a game that looked like a work by El Lissitzky, which is for those who don't know, he is a early 20th century Russian constructivist graphic designer, and he does a lot of stuff with shapes. So the game was about you'd play with the intersections of shapes and how they would juxtapose and things like that, and how they'd move around each other. And that became the game mechanic. Incidentally, it turned into Yar's Revenge. So the game is called Lissitzky's Revenge. But, I've shown it because they've been like, oh, well, we have a Lissitzky work, or work that looks, that borrows from Lissitzky, so it fits in with our collection and we can have a cross-pollination. Same thing with, Indie Arcade, we had somebody come up to me and say, I never really thought I was going to make it as an indie developer because I wasn't making stuff that would get into IGF, but then I made a game based on another artist, Mondrian, and then he's like, oh, well, now my Mondrian game got into an art museum because it was a Mondrian game. And then it creates an education about that artist. So I wouldn't say we can't be in art museums,
I wouldn't say that either.
but I think there's certain ones that could, but also certain ones that could be performance art venues, certain ones that could be in festivals, tech things. So I think it doesn't just have to be art museums, but I think a lot of people default to it because of the games are art thing.
Well, it's like movies too. Movies are art, but museums aren't always the best place to see them.
That's right. I mean, it's always tricky. I mean, some media just doesn't go well in museums. We don't have you don't go and read Virginia Woolf at the Met, because that's just not the right way to do it, right?
I would love a gigantic room with every word, and
Just
you start in the middle and you
spectacular,
kind of
right?
go around. That'd be
Yeah,
great.
I think Cormac McCarthy is the one
Yeah.
to do, just to save ink on punctuation.
Now I am thinking of a really amazing production of this, okay?
Yeah, right?
Or like
'cause, I mean,
reading
this-
a graphic novel as projected. That'd be,
That's
pretty
right.
cool.
Because, MoMA struggles with this, right? They're trying to build this permanent collection, and they're like, well, we think EVE Online should be part of
Yeah.
this. And they have no idea how to exhibit this. Because you're not going to have somebody come in and make a character and then sit in the museum for 400 hours? Be like, I got the experience.
And for real, if we can talk about the Smithsonian exhibit for a minute, because
Yeah.
I figured we probably wanted to do that anyways. I'll tell you right now, I hated the curation of that exhibit. I absolutely hated it. It's like walking into a museum and saying, oils, portrait, landscape, still life, acrylics, portrait, landscape, still life. The breakdown by platform and genre, I felt just did not work.
So here's the last piece, and then I think this could be a good segue into opening it up too. Because on one hand, I actually had similar thoughts, and I know that the curator of that exhibit had also similar thoughts. He was like, oh, well, I have to have it like this, and this is what people want. But at the same time, I think art of video games, and I'm not trying to be the defender of it, I'm more so saying I know some of the challenges it had, but because a lot of people had those criticisms. What do you think the steps are that games have to go through? What is the several exhibits that games have to go through before you could do the thing where we're going to curate? Actually, Jason Rohrer's games are now a self-contained art exhibit before we see that those start to be more commonplace. Because art of video games was just video games in the museum. There you go.
And in a lot of ways too, it's like trying to have the entire history of video gaming in a room about this size.
Yeah.
Which is a little ridiculous. You wouldn't try to fit the history of painting like that. you would select, you would curate, you would choose a canon within a smaller grouping for something
Yeah,
like
but you
that.
might think that like if nobody, or I shouldn't say nobody, if there was a large portion of the population that was skeptical about painting being worthy of being in an art museum, that might be the way to do it, right?
It gooses you to go bigger, I get that.
Yeah, I think that the art of video games was like a necessary evil, like the first step.
I wouldn't
right?
say evil, but I get where you're
or
going.
like it was like the medicine that we had to take as a culture, right?
But
like
I think you're
here's
right,
a
it's the
Smithsonian-
first step, right?
Yeah, it's the first one that we had to do.
Sometimes you have to do something wrong to do things right.
Yeah, and it's like, it's legitimizing the medium to boring people who don't know how great video games are.
Well, I think I didn't have super strong opinions either way. I did go to see it, and I can't really remember. So maybe apathy was kind of where I came down. But I think one strategy that has started to be adopted is to not necessarily think that you can possibly even display a game holistically, because games are not just games that are enacted. With
Games are
hardware and software.
experiences.
Right. Well, yeah, but not even speak of experiences. So you could do, for instance, like the way that the Museum of the Moving Image does with film, you can just get material objects associated with video games, and you could do an exhibition of just instruction manuals or an exhibition of just, and then try to break down, or this question we're having about art. I am 8-bit in art galleries being personal responses to video games. That can be its own kind of bounded criteria, and then other instances can be projected video footage only as curated in a certain way, and then others can be whatever. So the notion that it's a fool's errand to try to wholly encompass the multifaceted experiences of what video games are, and then slivering it out into a Trivial Pursuit pie of a different kind.
And I think that was actually, again, that's been really useful in the things I've done and been aware of too. I know I like to use the term confrontation with games, like you confront the people with games, and I have this little fantasy about the indie arcade where like some people, like the kids are playing a video game and the parents are like, what are you doing? We're gonna go see some culture, let's go to the art museum, and then they get there and indie arcade's going on, they're like, crap!
You do realize how unlikely that is in 2016, right?
I know. But, well, what I think is really interesting about that and exhibits like it and like art of video games is you are confronted with that in the area. Like you go to the art museum and suddenly like there's Sonic the Hedgehog, holy cow. And I like the idea of parts because I know that this has also been a conversation when game orchestras have shown up, because it's like, wait, you're gonna do like classical style music, but it's from what? And then there's all this discussion about like, but you're not listing it right and all these other things. But then they listen and they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, you're right. This is great music. So,
and incidentally, every one of those examples you listed a couple minutes ago is something I would be super interested in going to see.
yeah. So, they are, I think the confrontation is really good. And I think like, the mixing and matching of like, popular but also weird and unique, and yeah, like the visitation games, I think those are really cool. So I know we've got lots of things to talk about, but I wanted to open it up.
We can listen to the sound of our own voices all day.
Yeah,
easy.
right. Like we're all academics and teachers, so yeah, we're good at that. Okay, you had your hand up at the beginning, I remember. No, it's okay. So you reserved your spot. There you go. You've hit on a very core topic, and the struggle is real. No, you're right. So the word canon was thrown around a lot, and I don't like the word canon because it implies that there's a canon. And
you don't like
very
the word
postmodern of you.
exists.
Yeah, no, I mean it's true though, because like there's there's this great book that everybody should read called Replay: The History of Video Games. And what I think
It sounds like you're creating a canon when you say that.
I know, right? But one of the things that the author does that's really great for me, who is an American Western gamer, is he writes about, like, he takes 2 chapters to write about European gaming in the 80s. And I'm just like, I feel like I've stumbled onto somebody's alternate universe treasure trove of nostalgia. Like, this is some British kid's Nintendo memory. Like, that's the alternate universe of that. And it's the same thing. It's like, you know, who's to say that like, Dizzy games shouldn't be in stuff. So yeah, like, you're right, that it is really interesting, and this is a challenge we have where we'll get a really good game, like a fun game. Oh, that's a dangerous word.
It seems like we're trying to separate the criteria for video games so far from other sorts of art and media, even though thus far, I mean, especially being, you know, video games entering into the art world, the pattern is like the same as movies, photography.
Yeah.
They're not all that
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that, and this also gets into how different museums operate differently. No, this
This isn't you've
If you
brought
don't
up a really
challenge
good
us,
point.
we'll never learn.
like I mean, I think, I mean, what's the classic example? Like E.T. is like the whipping boy, right, for
It's
video
one of
games.
them.
That should probably be in a comprehensive museum about the
Yeah.
history of video games, not because it's excellent, but because it's I mean, as
It has cultural weight.
Kevin said,
Yeah.
right, it's representative, right, it's significant of something.
And actually, like, that, I give Art of Video Games a lot of credit for including Pac-Man, which was, it's like it's almost equal to E.T. in the place of, like, this caused the crash. I know that when we do some of the selections of games, sometimes there are games that are, like, by conventional standards. So this is something we struggle with, is like, there's the conventional way to judge games, graphics 5, sound 3.5, you know, kind of way.
And if I can, full disclosure, if I say something's good or bad, when I said I've only seen one good piece of video art, let me be clear. When I say good, I mean I liked it.
Yeah.
Personal preference is
Yeah, the context of the piano.
Yeah, no, well, so real quick, let me finish this thought. But, you know, like, we've had things that are conventionally good, but it's like, but this is really dissonant with this trend we see. So we've actually excluded games that we thought were conventionally very good games because we see, oh, there's a trend toward games that mix tabletop and digital content in an interesting way. So we're going to include that as a curated collection rather as a judged game. So yeah, but you're right, that's one of the struggles that we find ourselves in, is like conventional good game versus bad game judging and then curating a collection. Okay, you had your hand up early on too? Yeah, right, yeah.
Yes. For presenting video games, I came in a little late, so forgive me if this was mentioned, but have you thought of living history museums, arcades as living history? So rather, I know we talked a lot about the art perspective, but you set up an arcade and you go in as if you are, stepping back to when this was a functioning arcade.
so like in the spirit of like a colonial homestead sort of thing?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
You
Full
got,
disclosure, I work at one of those, but.
no, that's awesome.
There's like 20
you
of them
work
by
at
my
like the
house.
recreated arcade or the colonial home? I just want to be clear.
Okay.
Okay, very
Because
clear.
that'd be awesome. It'd be like, okay, so welcome to the arcade. Here is your slap bracelet. Here's a pair of LA lights that you have to wear now.
Right.
Wow,
Yeah.
I would really enjoy that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think they mostly exist. I think that when people have, there was a really good pinball museum in Baltimore that tried really hard to preserve this, and they eventually moved away from the money model of like put in a quarter, and it was like you pay a certain amount, you just played unlimited. But you could imagine really easily someone who's like, no, you know what, Street Fighter 2, it's a quarter. And you gotta, put your quarter on there to challenge somebody, because that's how it's supposed to be done, and that's how it's supposed to be experienced.
Yeah. Oh man, too much responsibility. You pick.
All right, right there in the middle.
Hi. Okay, so I'm an exhibitionist. Okay. I design exhibits for museums.
That's better.
Yep.
I like starting out like that.
Context got you really close to that.
Right?
My question is, when you're talking about museum, like working combining sort of, my specialty is mechanical interactive.
Mhm.
Which documented museums are actually called in museum world interactive.
Mhm.
So my question is, designing video games for museums in an educational component, or even for entertainment, how do you deal with the fact that there's a certain thing where okay, so I've designed a lot of stuff at the Air and Space Museum, and if you've been to some of the Smithsonian museums, you're like, oh my god, this machinery is like a dinosaur.
Yeah.
Like, this is older than the older console stuff. Like, I've designed things into they're like, we need you to retrofit this old console stuff. And I'm like, what is this? This is older than I am.
Yeah.
How do I do this? So, there's a degree of sort of trying to echo sometimes like an earlier age, but also, but the kids don't care.
No.
So for example, the Air and Space Museum, there's a room called How Things Fly. It's where you press all the buttons and push all the stuff, and everything happens. It's digital, interactive, and everything else. And it's the room where everybody goes. It's always packed. And so my question is kind of a combined lovely question. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about introducing maybe some characters or certain things, like Sonic shows you how speed works.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that being a way to introduce, I guess, you start with an educational angle, and that sort of gets museums on the radar of hey, this really works. And you have a character, you have something that they can relate to, and then museums want to invest more money in this stuff. Because right now they're like, iPads, everybody
What the
likes
hell is that
iPads, this is what we should
Right.
do.
Yeah.
But if you're actually going through and there's history and precedent behind this, people use this for therapy, people use this for all sorts of stuff. If you kind of combine these, I don't know, just go.
You said a lot of things in there, and I think one of the things that I heard is the idea of using it in an educational context, which I'm not opposed to, but I'm concerned that there would definitely be pushback from people who would view that as a kiddie space and not want to see it there, would rather see it in a more adult space. Although I think you're right, I think in an educational context, in a sort of thing like a children's museum or a science museum, I think would be very... Well, yeah, at a certain level, yes, absolutely.
I think it
But I think it
depends-
I think it would work.
Yeah. So licensing issues, and I did not work with Art of Video Games, but I know that they had licensing issues, for example, with GoldenEye. Like GoldenEye was originally supposed to be in it, and then, because the copyright things surrounding the original GoldenEye on N64 are very complicated because different people own different things now, right? So I know they couldn't have it in because of licensing issues. So on the other hand, there are developers who are like, you want to use it in an art museum? Great, So I think there is, if you found the right partner to have a conventional entertainment game in a museum and do that sort of thing, certain developers would probably be very amenable to that. I do think you do run into the problem if you are making a game for a museum. So the museum has games, right? But then you have to ask yourself, is the thing you go to see the game? Or are you there to play the game to learn about the news, and the news is the thing that is on display? So I think that's where you have to balance, what is the function of the game?
I go to the museum for the meum part, the last part, but
Yeah.
that's a bad joke. But I liked your question because it brings up this idea that you can use, you don't need to holistically use a game and plop it in a space. You can use an aspect of a game to do another thing, right?
Yeah.
So that you can license a character from a game to achieve another goal of the museum. Or I was thinking about how you could integrate decor, like pixel patterns from a game, into the carpet of a space, and that way the game is in the space, but the game is
good
not.
curation always does that, you know that.
The what?
It's like good curation always
Right,
does that, you know
but
that.
what I'm saying is that a way to kind of sell the idea beyond just the cultural legitimation, should it be in this space idea, is that games can be to use a bad word, cannibalize to do a lot of things that we don't normally think games
Well, but
can
how many
do.
times do we as advocates of games use the term, they're kind of the ultimate art form because they're programming, but then they're art, then they're music, and we cannibalize them in that statement.
Right.
To
But the
say
weird
that-
thing is, you would never talk about a painting, well, this guy owns the canvas and this guy owns the acrylic, so
Yeah.
what do we do?
Well, but at the same time, it's like, the great thing about games is that it is a product of many creative talents, so that you could use those creative talents as ambassadors. So, and I think music, again, we're at MAGFest, music is great for that because you can go and hear a piece of music and be like, that's very sophisticated, and be like, it's from Final Fantasy.
Well, it's like a wedge.
Yeah.
That's how you legitimize something.
Yep. Okay, so I want to get to more
We
questions.
should take Headband here, because he
Yeah.
closed the door for
Yeah,
us.
you, reward, you close the door for us.
All right, so let's say somebody has something that they consider significant.
Yes.
An unreleased game. There's only one copy. It hasn't been dumped. Somebody has that item and they realize it is significant and they want to have it shown or displayed somewhere. Who does that person approach? Where do they go? Is there anybody that they can go to yet? University, museum, is there anyone out there that's actively trying to preserve something?
That was a
actually
great-
work for one of those museums. Donate it to us, please.
That was easy.
My other question, do I have to give away my item or is it something that I can loan?
Well,
I think
this
that's
is
a question for her then.
Yeah, right?
It's either a write-off for permanent tax deductible donation, or it's a loan, in which case you can agree to get it back after the exhibition or at whatever time you request it, depending on the curator.
Okay.
But you have to ask the curator.
Okay.
But this does raise a really interesting question about what are the metaphysics of any particular video game. So most video games are multiple works in the same way that symphonies are, right? I can't destroy a video game by taking a copy of Star Fox and throwing it in the trash can and setting it on fire. I've done nothing to Star Fox. I've destroyed my cartridge, but not that. Similarly, I can't take a copy of the score of the Fifth Symphony and be like, see you later, and set it on fire, and no one can ever hear it again, right? Most video games are multiple in that they're just reproducible, and usually infinitely, right? So why have them in a museum? They might have different reasons for those kinds of video games in a museum. But some people can make video games and say, look, this is meant to be tied to this one object.
Yeah.
There's only one instance of it.
That was me.
If you play it, you're having to play this one. And it can't be played otherwise. Otherwise, it's an illegitimate, inauthentic copy, or it's deficient in some manner, right? Whether actually or just intentionally. And then that's when their presence in museums becomes even more interesting, because now this is my venue for getting this work out there.
Yeah.
When I'm not just disseminating it en masse via the internet or whatever.
And on the topic of who to go to, this is the perfect example of my experience, at least in this space. I've never had the experience of being like, I've got this thing, would you like it? I've got this thing, would you like it? It's mostly been the sort of networking thing. So if you're interested in networking in that space and maybe getting it in, what we just saw, where it's we're both going to a game thing about museums, and then a meaningful connection is made. When we started the thing we do at Smithsonian, it was because somebody who is in this audience, and thank you, Francis, said, hey, you should totally talk to so-and-so, and then, hey, we're interested in doing this, could we? And I was like, well, we have a bunch of indie developers who are looking for a place to show games, could we come and take over your space? And then that's what happened. So.
It's an awesome course of conversations that happen really close together. And I'm just like, hey, you guys want this thing? You guys want that one? It's like, Kalen wants to bring video games back into the museum. And I'm like, hey, I know Chris.
Yeah.
Really had this conversation.
There's no substitution for being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I should say, there's a lot of this going on, preservation and curation. University of Maryland has a whole program where they're trying to preserve digital worlds
Yeah.
or virtual worlds, and they're struggling with exactly these curatorial issues, which is how do you preserve World of Warcraft?
Really?
Yeah, especially the DLC stuff, where there's iterations always.
Which is the right one?
Which one do you pick?
Which one do you
Can we
pick?
get that one?
And so they've got the code, and they're trying to preserve the code, but then you've got this empty world because you don't have the 12 million people that were there in the first place. You've got just hollow towns. Well, have you preserved it?
Hey,
Right.
we should talk about that.
Who's next? I don't want this responsibility. It's too much.
Gentleman in the back's had his arm up for a long time.
Okay.
I asked this question like that. Do any of you guys ever run a museum? I'm talking about the four guys over there. Do any guys run a PG museum?
Do any of us run them?
You any of you run a
I
museum?
do not. I do not.
No. I know of several small ones. There are some out in California near the industry that do like smaller galleries of game museum stuff.
Are there any of those in New York and Westchester County?
The closest thing to you might be the closest thing to me, which is Fun Spot in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
It's an arcade museum and active arcade. I think it's free to get in. I think you just have to pay for tokens to play the games, and it's a good time, and it's got a lot of cool information in it.
Wait, is the museum at the arcade museum in New Hampshire, I can play arcade games there?
Yeah, it's all arcade cabinets.
Do you guys know if there's an actual museum of play? Do you guys
Yes.
Yeah.
In Strong Museum?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, go on.
You. In the, is that a Sans hoodie?
They're skulls.
Oh, okay. I thought it was from Undertale.
That would be cool though.
Yeah.
Okay, so, like I said, I work for the Digital Game Museum, one of the ones in California.
Okay.
As an interpretive writer for them. Two things for the good group and one question. I promise I'll keep it short. The group thing is legally, a museum, specifically a 501c3 museum, has to have education as their primary thing. They don't even have to be collectors, unless they're, say, a zoo, in which case conservation is the first priority for that kind of museum. So even in non-501c3s, that trickles down in museum theory as the legal definition of a museum has to have education as a major component. So an arcade would technically be a gallery. This is a discussion we had like last year at the Digital Game Museum. And my friend actually was researching video games in museums. This one's, I think, if you is doing research right now?
I am.
I came in before,
Yes.
during the introduction. And when she did the research for the PMA, she designed a little tiny video game for it. And after doing a bunch of surveys of museum professionals, mostly art museums, and what she concluded from that was that they really like RPG style. Like, if you remember, MS and Carta had that really weird video game. Also, Little Big Planet is that kind of model. It's what art museums really like. So those are the two for the good group. The question is another side of exhibiting and using video games for education. Is not the actual video game itself, but as inspiration, kind of going off of what you were suggesting. So 2 years ago, I ran a video game camp at a nature center, which was called Ashland Video Game. The nature center is Ashland Unplugged. So we were using video games to get kids out that hate being outside, but we did stuff that was not digital. Like, we did archery to learn about how to shoot like Link does. We played Disinterested Dinosaur Descendants, Dissatisfied, which was Angry Birds with a real-life giant slingshot and hurling eggs. They had to build
Lucky
shields,
kids.
and they went around and they fought and they solved riddles using the things they learned how to do, like animal tracking, to fight a boss at the end who would be evil Jimmy Dork. And then they also learned animal identification and created a nature deck and designed Pokemon based off all animals. So, like, would you say that counts as also video games in museums, even though there's no actual video games for it? And how does everybody feel about using that kind of approach to discuss them?
I think this gets represented in people trying to do like the best exhibitions they can now even, which is the difference between exhibiting a video game and exhibiting video game culture.
Yeah.
And this is a real problem with, like, video games are interactive objects. You're supposed to interact with them. But some video games, you can't properly interact with them in a museum setting or in a gallery setting. So what you do is you do something like a curated video that like walks you through. The MoMA's trying to do this with Dwarf Fortress. You can't have people from the public just walk in and try to play Dwarf Fortress, because that's not going to happen. So, exactly. So they're trying to like present it, which is a really weird way of, this just shows how unique, in a way, video games are. It would be like having, like a museum of painting, but no one was allowed to look at the paintings. Someone would just stand in the corner and look at the painting for you and describe it. And you'd be like, okay, well, thanks, that was worth it.
I think I would go there. That actually
It
sounds
does
really
sound-
great.
Now that I say that.
Yeah, let's start
yeah.
that.
Just as an aside, though, the idea of gamification in the classroom is something that we have another Mages panel here this weekend
Yeah.
that's going to be dealing with that, so you
Yeah.
might be interested in that.
And then I think one more?
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay, so one more. Okay. Maybe two, if, depending on how.
This is actually getting back to some of the online games or, online, my specialty was in online communication, so I was interested in like MUDs, moves, all the way down to MMOs. And you run into the preservation problem there of how do you preserve this community that may no longer be there.
Yeah.
And you can have the code, you can have the sound, but you don't have the people in it.
Yeah.
So how do you present it in what space do you present it in?
I mean, that's incredibly difficult. You
So-
have to have really good, I think really ingenious curators.
And it's interesting because at that point, you're almost not talking about an art object, you're talking about an archaeological object.
So, and I've actually been putting a lot of thought into this. So I wrote a book called The Architectural Approach to Level Design, and in it I outline some elements of level design that are analyzing game worlds as architectural objects. And yeah, so but yeah, you don't preserve it. And that's why I was like, we should talk, because,
I mean, unless you have like internet archives or you can build that. and
Right.
talk to people,
Yeah.
do, like,
It sounds like it would be a multimodal exhibition where not
Yeah.
only do you, as best as
Yeah.
possible, reconstruct the empty space, but then what it becomes is a matter of almost anthropological study of the community that made it live, and then so you would
Like a
solicit
historical
memories.
museum, yeah.
Right, and
Yeah.
but essentially what you would get in my imaginary version is several different strategies attempting to capture something you can't capture, right? It's that ineffable quality that's precisely the thing that you want to show everyone of how great it is, but it's precisely the thing you can't get back to, right?
yeah, it's like, you know.
Here's a preserved example of the town, and
Yeah.
here's an object that they would use in their daily life, and here is a testimonial about what it was like to experience
Yeah,
this.
I'm imagining like you'd have to get that, you know, the equivalent of, but broken up for the exhibit, that documentary that talks about the people that played, you know, WoW, and then you have the couple that's like, we met on WoW, and, you know, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it might just get as weird as like you end up having like Civil War reenactments, but
Yeah.
for like World of Warcraft, like in the actual game though. So it's a little more.
I'm thinking of the statues you always see in the history museums.
You know, now I'm imagining a guy in a back room, and his job is to reenact Leroy Jenkins.
Yeah, that's right.
And like, that's what you do. You just have to, like, 8 hours a day, you know, you are Leroy Jenkins.
That would be a good
Again
job.
and again. That would
be a pretty sweet job.
So
Yeah.
one more, or?
Okay, so one more. Let's do one more.
One more. There's a closing sentiment.
Okay. You.
Royalty.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Kaylin.
Just quick thing, like with Video Games Live coming up on Saturday.
Yeah.
Like the Symphony of the Dice coming up in April. What if there was an exhibit that would be able to take the music that, if they decided beforehand, make an exhibit with some of the games, with like demos of them, and then have it where you could actually hear the music as an orchestral thing? Would that work as a possible exhibit?
Yeah, I think,
Like,
well,
like bringing all that together is like you have the music, you have the game, you have the history of the game, you have a way of looking at it.
And-
you get orchestral.
and I think this speaks to a thing that we've been sort of dancing around, which is like, it's games in museums don't have to mean, here's Super Mario Brothers 3. Behold. It could be, you have to be very creative about like saying, all right, here's a game, a snippet of a game, but like put your headphones on because now you're hearing the comparison between chiptunes and this other piece. Okay,
And also, I mean, we've been talking about like one-off games. I mean, this might be a way just for museums to leverage the resources and abilities they have to do something that you can't experience at home. You
Yeah.
can't experience in the arcade. Yeah,
yeah,
I think that's exactly right.
exactly.
That's a great
So,
thing to end on, I think.
yeah.
Yeah,
All
so
right.
everyone, get out there and go to the museum.
Go out there and go to the museum or curate some
Go
stuff.
curate, yeah.
Yeah, we should talk about
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick note, I'm giving a very controversial talk on Saturday where I'm arguing that games cannot be artworks, so please come and yell at me.